There are many contentious stories about Jesus visiting hell after his death and before his resurrection. The idea of this video is to lay bare most of the texts that talk about this experience of Jesus and allow you make your own inference, and take your stand about the story of the experience of Jesus in hell. According to the Old Testament, everyone who died, whether they were righteous or not, went to Sheol, a place of darkness and stillness. Sheol is divided into sections based on the righteousness or unrighteousness of those who have passed away in a number of Second Temple period works that elaborate on this idea. The eternal fate of those who are condemned at the final judgment is variously described as Gehenna, the outer darkness, or a lake of eternal fire. The New Testament maintains a distinction between Sheol, the common place of the dead, and this place. The harrowing of hell, which is Latin, is called descensus Christi ad inferos, meaning Christ's descent into hell or Hades, is an Old English and Middle English word referring to the time between Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection in Christian theology. Christ's triumphal descent delivered salvation to the souls who had been imprisoned there from the beginning of time. The Apostles' Creed and the Athanasian Creed, called the Quicunque Vult, both mention Jesus Christ's entry into the land of the dead, stating that he descended into the underworld, descended ad inferos, yet neither mentions that he released the dead. In 1 Peter 4 verse 6, the New Testament mentions his descent to the underworld, stating that glad tidings were proclaimed to the dead. Ephesians 4 verse 9, which indicates that Christ sank into the lower regions of the earth, also supports this interpretation, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Different interpretations have been ascribed to these Bible texts. On Holy Saturday, the liturgical calendar commemorates the harrowing of hell. The story initially appears in the Gospel of Nicodemus in the portion called the Acts of Pilate, which also appears separately at earlier dates within the Acts of Peter and Paul, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia. In Old English poems, the descent into hell was described in connection with the names Cadnan, or Christ, and Satan and Kinewulf. It is then repeated in Ulfric of Eynsham homilies, which is the earliest recorded use of the word harrowing, around 1000 AD. The most complete and dramatic elaboration of the subject can be found in Middle English dramatic literature. The Anastasis, Greek for resurrection, is a topic in Christian art that is considered a creation of Byzantine culture and first appeared in the West in the early 8th century. According to the Old Testament, when people died, whether good or unrighteous, they went to Sheol, a dark, quiet realm. Several Second Temple texts build on the concept of Sheol, dividing it into divisions according to the righteousness or sinfulness of people who have died. The New Testament distinguishes between Sheol, the ordinary abode of the dead, and Gehenna, the outer darkness, or a lake of endless fire, the eternal destiny of those condemned at the final judgment. The Hellenistic notions of heroic descent into the underworld and successful return are based on traditions that predate the mystery religions of Christ's time. A scene like this can be seen in Gilgamesh's epic, as well as Odyssey 11. Virgil put it in the Aeneid, which he wrote shortly before Jesus' birth. The little we know about mystery religions like the Eleusinian Mysteries and Mithraism implies that the initiate's death and rebirth was an integral aspect of their rituals. This, too, has earlier similarities, particularly with Osiris worship. The Apostles' Creed uses the Greek word v in katathanta eis ta katotata, which is translated as descended ad inferos in Latin. The Greek ta katotata, the lowest, in Latin inferos, those under, can alternatively mean underworld, netherworld, or abode of the dead. In long-established English use, the place into which Jesus descended is known as hell, but other Christian theologians refer to it as Sheol or limbo to distinguish it from the hell of the condemned. Hades, the underworld inhabited by departed souls, is ruled by the god Pluto in Greek mythology. Some New Testament translations refer to the habitation or state of the dead as Hades to indicate a neutral location where the dead awaited Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The word harrow stems from the Old English her John, which means to harry or despoil, and may be found in Alfric's homilies from around 1000 AD. The term harrowing of hell refers not only to the idea that Jesus descended into hell, as stated in the Creed, but also to the rich tradition that developed later, asserting that he triumphed over Inferos, freeing hell's captives, especially Adam and Eve, as well as the righteous men and women of the Old Testament period. Several texts in the New Testament mention or allude to the harrowing of hell. 1. Matthew 12 verse 40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. 2. Acts 2 verse 24. But God raised him up, having freed him from death, a. because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. 3. Acts 2 verse 31. Foreseeing this, David spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, saying, He was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh experience corruption. 4. Colossians 1 verse 18. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. 5. 1 Peter 3 verses 18 to 19. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison. 6. 1 Peter 4 verse 6. For this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead, so that, though they had been judged in the flesh as everyone is judged, they might live in the Spirit as God does. Hans Urs von Balthasar, a theologian, draws links between Mark 2 verses 24 to 27 which says, If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. And in Matthew 16:18, And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, speaks of Jesus' power and the impotence of Satan. Theologians of the early church taught about the harrowing of hell. Saint Melito of Sardis, died c. 180, wrote about it in his homily on the Passover and more specifically in his homily for Holy Saturday. Tertullian, a treatise on the soul, though he himself disagrees with the idea, Hippolytus. Treatise on Christ and Antichrist, Origen, against Celsus, 2 verse 43, and later Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Epiphanius all made reference to the harrowing of hell, which was also discussed by the early heretic Mark Ion and his adherents. According to John of Damascus, the Christolites, a sect from the 6th century, thought that Jesus died and was resurrected from hell with his divinity. The Second Temple's veil was torn in half, and many people rose from the dead. These people then walked around Jerusalem after the resurrection and were observed by a large number of people, according to the Gospel of Matthew. This is a visionary and imaginistic description of Jesus defeating death itself, according to Balthasar. The Apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus claims that Christ's raising Lazarus from the dead before his own crucifixion served as a preview of the harrowing of hell. Chapters 17 to 27 of the Acts of Pilate are referred to as the Descensus Christi ad Inferos. This text is frequently included with the widely read medieval Gospel of Nicodemus, and is based on an original that may date back to the 3rd century AD. They include a dramatic conversation between Prince Satan and Hades as well as the King of Glory's entrance, which is supposedly from Tartarus. Hades is a figure from Greek mythology who represents the afterlife. Hades has been interpreted, among other things, to mean the unseen one. The Olympian gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter are brothers to Hades, the Titan Kronos' first child. The underworld was to be Hades' domain. Hades has been pictured as a regal, dark-bearded god. He was portrayed as either Pluton, the giver of wealth, splashing fertility from a cornucopia, or as Aidoneus, who was enthroned in the underworld and held a scepter with a bird's beak. His Greek name Platon, the Lord of Riches, which was translated by the Romans as Dis, or Pluto.